Hey, let's get started with today's Sustainability Essentials webinar. I am Susan Ingalls, a Direct Sustainable Furnishings Counsel. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to today's Sustainability Essentials webinar presentation of a discussion of CO2 emissions and your health. We are very pleased to have guest presenters today, Arnaud, Brohe, and Bill Russell, both of CO2 Logic. They want to hear from you, and we want to hear from you too. So please send in your questions and comments via the chat box. You will have noticed that I have you all on mute, but we do want to hear from you. So send in any questions or comments as we go along, and we'll respond to them at the end. To start with, I am going to give a little background about Sustainable Furnishings Council. We are 14 years old now. We were, when we were formed, it was a group of suppliers of materials and manufacturers of all kinds of furnishings products and stores where these things are sold, and design firms, as well as environmental organizations that came together, and that continues to make up the membership now. We're nearly 400 companies strong. Each of these companies has made their own public and verifiable commitment to sustainability, to transparency, and to continuous improvement. And we support companies in realizing their commitment by providing guidance and resources and giving them marketing support. They can use the member seal in all marketing and advertising. So if you're not yet a member, you're invited to join. And if you're interested in the kinds of things we're talking about today, I hope you will also consider taking our Green Leaders class. It's a 6-hour, 6 CEU course that covers what is this sustainability stuff and what does it have to do with us in furnishings. It has lots of questions to ask, answers to look for, and it includes a powerful sales training module to help you put it all together and build your business and do your job better. So there is more where this comes from. Sustainability, as y'all probably know, is an umbrella term, and there are many, many different specific things that fall under this wide umbrella. We at Sustainable Furnishings Council are concerned about all of them, but we do try to put our attention where we know we can make the biggest difference the most immediately. And certainly reducing CO2 emissions is an example of that. But let's look at how we in this industry are related to these issues. We are a global manufacturing industry, so we use a lot of electricity in all those factories that make all our furnishings products. Those factories are using materials, no matter where the factory is, are using materials that come from all over the world and are transporting finished product to all over the world. So we have a large footprint in burning fossil fuels. Most of our fossil fuels in our world are burned for generating electricity and for transportation. A lot of CO2 emissions come from deforestation, and we have a large responsibility there because we use so much wood. And not only that, we in the furnishings industry add the highest value to the wood resource, whether it is a fine exotic hardwood or a reclaimed piece of barnwood. We do add the highest value when we make it into a piece of furniture that'll last for generations and generations. Now, when we make it into a piece of furniture, we frequently use a lot of glue and put a finish on it. Both adhesives and finishes can contain a lot of volatile organic compounds, which are chemicals that volatilize into our indoor environments, being part of the atmosphere we breathe when we're indoors and frequently harming our health, especially when our houses are as tight as they are these days. There are lots of VOCs that stay in there for years. There are other hazardous chemicals that are commonly used in furnishings, including flame retardants, highly fluorinated stain treatments, antimicrobials, and PVC. These are all persistent in the environment and known to harm human health as well as other life on our planet. And being persistent in the environment, when they make their way into waste streams, they exist as toxic waste. The textiles industry, for instance, uses a lot of chemicals. It's one of the most chemically intensive, using 10 to 100% of the weight of the fabric in chemical inputs. And leather tanning is also very chemically intensive. These things can lead to water pollution and to other harm to human health. And many of us are surprised to realize how human health in so many ways is compromised by our industry. Cotton, for instance, is currently cultivated with forced labor in 19 countries to this day, according to the ILO. So that is a shocking thing, and of course, something that we don't want to knowingly participate in. Finally, we in the furnishings industry actually throw away a lot of furniture. And the fact is that there is no away. It all goes somewhere. Our landfills are overcrowding and currently are made up, 6% of our landfills here in the US are made up of furnishings. So you can see we have a direct connection to many sustainability problems. At Sustainable Furnishings Council, we address these problems with initiatives such as the What's It Made Of initiative, which we're working with partners to raise awareness about the handful of hazardous chemicals that are most commonly found in furnishings, and to try to stimulate innovation towards their elimination. Another important initiative is our wood furniture scorecard, in which we assess retailers for their wood furniture sourcing policies, looking at whether they have a policy, whether it is a robust one, whether it seems to be implemented well. And we are very pleased to celebrate those many companies that do have good policies well implemented. We'll be announcing the results of the 2020 scorecard in October. These things are important because our world is heating up. You can see here a video of weather anomalies since early in the Industrial Revolution, and you will notice that we are having more and more weather events that are warmer than usual instead of cooler than usual. You can see that the planet has gotten a lot hotter, and this is before our current day. Here we are just at 2014, and look, it's all red and orange. So we are very, very pleased to have Arnaud Brohe and Bill Russell with us today to talk about those CO2 emissions that are warming up the planet more than anything else and are actually compromising our own health. Thank you, Arnaud and Bill, for being here.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this really nice introduction.
Yep, thank you, Susan.
I hope we managed to be as clear as you were. That was a perfect introduction to what we want to cover today. So first of all, let us introduce ourselves. So I'm going to let my colleague Bill, who joined the firm recently, but who is a renowned veteran in our industry, start by introducing himself, and then I'll give a little bit more of background about CO2 Logic and myself.
Thank you, Arnaud. Sure. As you can see, we have a couple of bullet points for each of us, but as I was listening to Susan at the beginning, I was reminding myself that I actually came into sustainability from a background as a chemical engineer, and I've spent work with the Green Chemistry Council and also the U.S. Green Building Council. So we have already worked with those organizations, and I think that their interconnections with the furniture industry are very, very helpful.
Yes.
Do you want to say a little bit more about, you like a few bullet points. So Bill, you used to be environmental practice leader at PwC, and he's also author of a book called The Sustainable Enterprise Field Book, which is a really good introduction to corporate sustainability. My background is also in sustainability. So I come from Belgium in Europe, moved to the US 4 years ago to establish CO2 Logic. And we advise corporations on the best strategies to reduce, calculate, reduce, and offset their greenhouse gas emission. So we have about 25 clients. Half of them are for Fortune 500 clients, including some of them in the furnishing industry. We have been doing some work with Steelcase, and yeah, I spent my entire career on carbon and climate. Also wrote a book on carbon markets, which I believe is one important piece of legislation that we would need at some point. At least carbon pricing is something that we will need in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emission. We are not going to look at the agenda for today, so that it's a dense agenda, but we want to make sure we keep 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. But basically, our key message is that there are two curves that we need to flatten. We have all experienced the COVID crisis in different ways, and I hope that all of you are safe at home. But there is another curve that we need to flatten rapidly. It's the greenhouse gas emission concentration curve. We need to keep it below the planetary threshold, otherwise temperature are just going to keep increasing. And what you saw in the small video that Susan shared with us, as she said, it was just a situation in 2014. It could look much more dire very soon. Then Bill is going to, again, re-emphasize the role that the furnishing industry can play and should play in climate mitigation. And then we will both present some of the links between climate change and human health. And we will detail this looking at things such as, of course, severe weather events. When we think about climate change, probably many of you, and of course it depends in which states you are listening from, but we think about Katrina, we think about Hurricane Sandy, we think about wildfire in California, and these things are becoming more and more frequent and are directly linked to climate change. All those changes are also creating food insecurity, not only in the US, but globally, so that could threaten global stability. You will also learn that changing temperature can also increase the number and the type of disease that we will face in the future. And of course, climate change and CO2 pollution, it's linked to the use of fossil fuel, and fossil fuels are also responsible for other pollutants that are also detrimental to our health. So very important to consider those issues whenever you can in your work as well, and also of course in your private life. What Bill will then discuss, and that will be an introduction to our conclusion, it's really acknowledging the fact that science and anticipating irrational human behavior is a must. We need to trust science. We need to talk with experts, and the thing we are discussing is really serious. It's really about the future of mankind as we know it today. And this is not something that will happen in 200 years. It's something that many of us will experience in our lifetime. And so we will conclude with a call to action for the furnishing industry that will be beneficial for humans and planetary health. So as I said in the introduction, you are all familiar with the first curve. We need to flatten, of course, the number of COVID cases, and the reason being that we need to make sure that we don't exceed the healthcare system capacity. That was why it was very stressful for Bill and myself to be in New York in March, where we could see that the hospitals were reaching the capacity threshold. It's exactly the same when we think about climate action. What we need to make sure is that our temperature, the average global temperature does not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, and at least stay well below 2 degrees Celsius, so 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, because if we go above those uncharted territory, the consequences are going to be enormous and potentially irreversible. So that's why we really need to flatten the global temperature, and the best way to do it is to flatten our CO2 emissions.
So as we were thinking about the interconnections now between the
Let's see, Bill, have we lost you? Let's look and see what happened to your sound.
Are you hearing me now?
Bill, we are.
Yeah.
Now I can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, and just let me know if I die out for any other reason here. So anyway, the furnishing industry, as Arnaud was saying, you know, we do see that it has a place, and all industries have to do some part in mitigating their carbon emissions if we're going to get to the 1.5 to 2 degree temperature increase goals that we as a society need to do. So looking at those interconnections, the first thing that I want to share is that I think, and my sustainability background has allowed me to start thinking in what we talk about as systems thinking. And when you become a real passionate practitioner of systems thinking, you realize that everything is interconnected. So this idea of climate change as an individual challenge, no, it's actually interconnected with COVID-19. It's actually interconnected with things like social justice and poverty. So all of the things that the Furnishing Council was already addressing in Susan's introduction, we see those as interconnected risks, and that's why I think this particular challenge is so exciting to deal with, because we have an opportunity to synergistically solve many problems with the innovations that we'll come up with. So looking at the furniture industry specifically, first of all, your system, as I see it, fits within the greater subsystem of the environment, which we would call the built environment. And when we look at global emissions of the built environment, that's contributing about 39% of all of the global emissions. So that obviously means that the building sector has a big part to play, and then the furnishings sector has its part to play within the buildings sector. So as we're trying to attack this existential crisis for the world, over 90 countries have already made goals associated with reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector as part of their national goals. So now when we're trying to look at within those building sector emissions, about 11% of the global emissions come from what we talk about as embodied carbon. So that's the carbon that resides from the materials that the buildings are being made from, as well as all of the different life cycle aspects of those materials, which we'll get into in the next slide. And then, like we said before, like the US Green Building Council, there are industry associations and global initiatives that have tried to lead this whole sustainability charge for the different industries and sectors. And the Sustainable Furnishings Council, of course, is a great example of that. And so the World Green Building Council has already set a target for this industry of reducing the embodied carbon so that it can be reduced by 40%. And I think you'll see some other goals that are similar to that. Oh, before I switch to the next slide, I'll just share with you that we had a lot of fun picking pictures here. And so I have to note that you know, the first one is supposed to represent the home furnishing side of things. And I see all the nice plants, the woods, as Susan was talking about, and also the nice bright lights. And one of the things that that brought to my mind was that home furnishings are so vital to the well-being of all of the home, you know, the people that live in homes, and also the interconnection here with psychology. So you know, people feel good when they live in a nice, healthy home environment. And then I switched over to the office furnishings market and thinking today about how all of these offices are being disrupted and having to reconfigure their furnishings layouts and their furnishings designs because of COVID right now. And so you can see now that the office environment is going to be so much less inviting, associated with wearing masks and gloves and having to have plastic dividers between us. And then also, as we're having fun right now using web videos from our homes, distance learning, now all of a sudden we're going to find home offices as a key furnishings element of our homes. So I just thought that was a fun thing to bring in as we move on here. Next slide. So I just wanted to connect what we do with CO2 Logic, which is a lot of this greenhouse gas inventory work, and the furnishings industry, and how it all kind of fits together. So we had talked on the previous slide about how the buildings and construction emissions represent about 39% of the total global emissions. And then when we're trying to say, well, how much might the furniture industry contribute to that, it gets to what we talk about as the embodied carbon, which represents about 28% of the overall building's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So about 72% of the building industry's carbon footprint is represented in operational emissions. That's sort of the electricity and heating associated with the actual operations of all buildings. So your role here is trying to get that 28% to shrink. In the emissions accounting side, you know, right now, you know, Arnaud and I, we have technology companies that are trying to make the conduct of creating a greenhouse gas emissions inventory much simpler. So the idea, most people only really measure their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and those are the emissions from electric production and the operations of, you know, the fuel burning, for example, of the facilities, and that includes your own operations. So when you're considering your own greenhouse gas footprints, your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are going to be a large part of your own carbon footprints. But then we have this other thing called scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and that's really the emissions associated with your suppliers. And in your case, since you're producing a good that's coming into the buildings, you're counted as a supplier to the owners and tenants which you're selling to. So that's why this is so critical, is that embodied carbon is really showing up in the scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions accounting category. And then I just wanted to, even though that element of greenhouse gas accounting is still a work in progress, there's a lot of work in life cycle analysis and technology to help make these scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions more precise and more efficient to be collected. I just wanted to close this particular slide by saying, as an example of how serious this is all getting to the buildings industry, Arnaud and I work in New York City, and New York City has a new law that they've passed called Local Law 97. And if you're not familiar with it, it's going to affect over 50,000 buildings in New York City alone. And those buildings are going to have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. And it's going to require as much as $16 to $24 billion of additional construction and investments by those building owners to achieve these goals. So this has become very real to the buildings industry in Manhattan, and that Manhattan example is one that's being looked at by cities across the world. Next slide.
Thank you, Susan. So what I want to cover with this slide, and I realize that we are getting a little bit behind schedule, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's really to make clear that global climate continue to change and that it's going to have a major effect on health. And when we look at the type of effects that we are discussing about, we're talking about extreme weather events. We are talking about very high risk that future population will face various type of disease that are climate related. We know that lack of climate action is going to cost thousands, if not millions of lives. And we're also talking about things such as transnational and intergenerational inequality. Because one of the things that we have to be aware is that we are all contributing to climate change by consuming fossil fuel, but of course some of us are going to be more affected if you think about it, and that's the equity issue that Bill mentioned in the introduction, and the fact that everything is interrelated. But if you think about people living in some of the most dangerous places today, they are often the poorest ones. So if you think about people in Bangladesh or people living in an area which is prone to flooding, for instance, they tend to be less privileged people. And so for social reasons, as well as for protecting human health, we need to take action. And what I'm going to cover in the next 2 slides is some of those effects when it comes to food and pollutants. So Suzanne, please, can you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So what we see here is that we are already at 1 degree Celsius of warming, and that's an average. So 1 degree is the global average. If we look at the northern hemisphere, and if we look at Canada, for instance, or Greenland, temperature are already much higher today. And it's degrees Celsius, so it means it's already 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial level. If we take serious action in the next 10 years, which is why, all those movements, the climate strikes that many students initiated last year is critical. If we take immediate and radical action in the next 10 years, we can still limit those temperature increase. So that's what you would see on the map on the left. However, and Suzanne, please, can you click on this? If we do not act, this is what the future might look like. We might have temperature increase of an average of 10 degrees Fahrenheit before the end of the century. The world would be different with those temperatures. And again, it's an average. So if you look at some places, you realize that in the Arctic Ocean, temperature would be 15 degrees Fahrenheit higher, meaning that like the Arctic Ocean would just melt, leading to sea level rise that is already affecting many places in the world. We're talking about Manhattan, but if you think London, if you think about many big cities, Singapore, etc., major hubs are on the seaside. And if you have sea level rise, that means that we need to either leave those places or invest billions in infrastructure to try to protect. And there is only a certain level to which we will be able to afford those protection. And again, it's only the very rich cities that will be able to cope with those increase in sea level, and many places will become we just become flooded. So that's something we have to bear in mind when we think about the consequences of climate action. Can we please move to the next slide?
So when we were looking at this particular slide, obviously it's got a North American focus to it, but it does demonstrate how all of those different interconnections between climate change and human health risks, how they affect different regions in specific ways. And so, I think we can all now see that climate change is a risk today, not necessarily for 2040 or 2080. And we're already experiencing the extreme precipitations in the Northeast, the hurricanes in Florida, and of course all of the sea level rise and hurricane flooding that was occurring in Houston, for example, very recently. And then we'll be talking more about you know, the heat waves and the wildfire. So all of these are current and worsening climate change impacts that all also have interconnected exacerbations to healthcare risks. Next slide. So when we think about healthcare risks, and particularly healthcare risks with climate change, there's one risk that is a bit dramatic, but it's called death. And so this is just looking at the one health effect of death, and you can see how each of the different weather-related, severe weather-related activities all tend to contribute to death. And an interesting thing about this slide is many of us can empathize and worry about things like immediate danger from lightning storms or hurricanes, but the one that causes the most deaths is the slow one, and the one that we tend to, you know, just endure, and psychologically it's kind of out of sight, out of mind while we're enduring it, and that's the effect of heat waves. And yet that is the one that causes the most human health deaths of all of these weather effects. Next slide.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Another obvious risk, especially in the US, is wildfire. And this is not only in the US. You might remember from the news that, of course, in Australia or in Greece or in Portugal, they had also deadly wildfires over the last 2 years. But that one is becoming a serious threat, especially to California. You can see some more examples on next slide as well, please. So fire, of course, there is the direct effect of fire, but then there is also all the indirect effects of breathing smoke from wildfires that creates eye and respiratory tract irritations. It can reduce your lung function. If you suffer from asthma, that can also be very detrimental, and it can, in the worst cases, lead to heart failure and premature death. So definitely one risk that we want to keep in mind and keep as low as possible. Also, as Bill said, everything is interrelated, and we see that today in California, they have two crises to face. They know that they will need to face the wildfire season, which is a trend. Like there's always been wildfire in California, but we see that they are more intense and more frequent than what they used to be. But this year they need to cope this on top of pandemics, and that's why you see that we should really take care of the climate crisis, because of course there will be other issues than climate. Climate is not the only issue that we are going to face in the 21st century, but that's going to create extra challenges and extra difficulties to solve all the other crises that we might face in our existence. Next slide, please.
So now we're going to pick up on one of the interconnected health effects, which is food security and food shortages. And so how does climate change affect food? And then also when we start to think about how food interconnects with our health and our well-being. So first of all, we have the direct effects that we've already talked about: more severe droughts, the heat waves, and another one that, again, because we don't all necessarily have access to the oceans, but it is a very, very severe and current effect of climate change is the dying out of our coral reefs and coral bleaching, and how that affects the ecosystem of the fish stocks that so many people, particularly in the coastal regions, rely on for their food sources. So basically we're looking at a global, not just a US, global effect of reducing crop yields. So that's a major thing in terms of our food supplies. But then as indirect effects from all of that, what we don't often appreciate is how it's going to also reduce the ability of workers to do the harvesting of our crops. So we've already seen that over 50 billion hours of labor has been lost in terms of their reduced capacity to do the harvesting of the crops because they can't work in extreme heat conditions. And then, of course, the inability of farmers to harvest their crops. All of a sudden, you're now reducing that yield of the crops as well. And so really, really interconnected risks here. And I also wanted to take a minute here to remind us of the social justice impacts of food, because one of the slides that we didn't show you showed, global food insecurity risks, and it showed the United States as being in the gray zone, which almost indicated that there was no food insecurities in the United States because we're such a wealthy country. Well, that's just not true. And there's actually quite a bit of food insecurity risk in the United States itself. And the COVID virus experience exposed that. So when we shut down our school systems, all of a sudden we realized that the school systems were the primary source of food for so many people that were, in poverty. And I don't think people were as aware of that fact until the COVID crisis brought it to our attention. So this idea of food security is a global one, and it's also a local one. Next slide. So this one, I had a lot of fun preparing this one, and if Alex is on the webinar, Alex was one of our CO2 Logic colleagues that helped us prepare these slides, and he and I had a lot of fun actually trying to understand what were these words that talk about diseases. So if you look at the graph on the left, I had to go and educate myself on what was an Aedes aegypti or Aedes albopictus, and what those are is different mosquitoes. Okay, so what we're talking about here is the interconnection between moisture content and the proliferation of mosquitoes, and that is the major transmission source for viruses like the dengue virus. Okay, so we're talking about in this particular case mosquitoes as and the increases in humidity and air temperature as directly affecting the transmission rates of those viruses. And then we also have things like malaria and parasites, which is another major source of disease spreading, and those are different than viruses. So I had to understand myself some of these nuances between viruses and diseases like malaria. And then we have the Vibrio bacteria things, which is more, that's about cholera and some of the things that are more waterborne diseases or water nurturing things. And so increases in sea level temperature, for example, will affect that particular proliferation of those types of bacteria and diseases. If you click, Susan, we have another graph that just kind of reiterates these interconnections. So this one is more associated with the pathogen spreading in the northeast of the United States. So where in some cases where we think we've actually eradicated some diseases, all of a sudden because of these changes in weather circumstances and humidities, all of a sudden diseases that we thought we had eradicated can re-emerge. And this is happening all over the world for sure, and also in the United States. So we're not, even though we're a wealthy country, we're not immune to it. And just an interconnecting comment here, but when we think about this transmission, particularly the vector transmission issue, the COVID virus, right? What was the transmission vector for the COVID virus? We think, scientifically, we think it started with bats. And then we look at these wet markets in China. And by the way, there are wet markets right here in New York, so they're everywhere. But how would humans start to see our connections with bats and the possibility that we're going to be exposed to bats? And one of the things is actually food insecurity, because people start to eat different animals that they wouldn't normally eat if they could afford to eat, say, beef or pork or chicken. But when they can't afford those types of meats, they'll start to buy things like bats and actually eat them as part of their food supply. Not something that I'm going to be participating anytime soon, but something to keep in mind as a possibility of the creation of new pathogens and new diseases and how they actually do spread. Next slide. So now we're talking about the interconnection here between COVID virus for sure, and air pollution and climate change. So one of the things that we've already shown in the first slides of the furniture industry is how hazardous chemicals and such can affect things like asthma. And certainly asthma is one of the diseases that particulate matter exacerbates extensively. And when we think about ambient air pollution, do you realize that it actually causes 4.2 million deaths per year from air pollution? So now we have this COVID experience, and I think now this really caused a raised awareness as to how much of this air pollution it's not natural, it's human induced. And so you can see here the difference in China of nitrous oxide emissions. The top 3 graphs are from 2019, and then all of a sudden we have this economic shutdown, and we see that nature didn't normally have that much nitric oxide in the atmosphere, and you can see how quickly the resiliency of nature allowed itself to eliminate that nitric oxide and therefore reduce all of the exposures to people from it. And just that little short period of economic shutdown was projected to save 4,000 lives of children under 5 years old and 73,000 adult lives in China alone, just from this brief economic shutdown. So the opportunity for us to change our behaviors and improve our air condition and improve our health all exists. Now I'm going to just go back one point real quickly. Go back to the previous slide. So one of the things that we're now struggling with is the idea, you can go to the next one, but actually this one still, because what we're trying to express here with these graphics is when you look at a graphic like this, how many people can emotionally attach themselves and understand their own personal impact on something like nitrogen dioxide emissions, right? So that's kind of the science communication of human health risks and of climate change risks. So now we can go to the next slide. So now this is something that I think everyone can now more emotionally understand about what's going on in the world today. That left-hand side of that picture is the world that we were all living within and we didn't believe was possible to improve or change. And then all of a sudden the COVID virus hits us. We appreciated at the global level that all countries needed to come together and shut down this economy in order to protect our health. We were not thinking that in the protecting of our health from social exposures, what that would do in terms of reducing and improving our health in the short term from things like the economic and air emissions health of society that we so busily work in every day. And so all of a sudden you saw these drastic improvements in the environmental conditions of major cities across the world. And so this one just happens to be New Delhi, India, but just look at that picture and absorb it. And emotionally, we can see now what is possible for the world. Next slide. So this brings us to our challenge as scientists and as people who are well educated and aware that climate and health are both issues that we need to start tackling. But how are we going to successfully get people to change behaviors? And one of the things, unfortunately for me as an engineer, I work in that logical part of my brain. And I believed incorrectly that once I show people their carbon footprints and these scope 1, scope 2, 3 emissions, and I give them factual information about how they can reduce their emissions, that they're going to quickly act. And unfortunately, we have seen with climate change over the 20+ years that I've been working to get people to make changes in their behavior and make changes in their investments as building owners, that we are failing. And so we run into these problems at the top here from things like science denial. And so how are we going to break through that? And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that psychologists have already been working on exploring and researching how can we transform psychological worldviews in order to confront climate change. And that includes very difficult things like having people not think exclusively in the immediate terms of what they're experiencing in the world, but trying to be able to comprehend and imagine what the future conditions will look like. And unfortunately, that is really hard. The same thing happens with health effects. So why do we see people, especially young people, taking bigger risks with things like not wearing masks during the COVID virus or smoking cigarettes, for example? It's because when you're young and strong, you think you're invincible. You don't think you're ever going to die. But the scientific facts are that you are damaging your body and you're not going to live a long time. So now I'm going to shift my tone a little bit. Let's start talking about the hopefulness that this type of understanding can bring to our research, our exploration of solutions, and also how, as scientists, we can start to be more successful in getting our message across. And so I ran across, and actually my sister shared with me that little pink dot there. And it's, you know, it's our joke about the virus, right? An epidemiologist, an ICU doctor, and a scientist all walk into a bar. Oops, just kidding. They all know better, right? So what's the message there? It's that science matters. And if you understand science, you'll make better decisions. But if I communicate that through some factual discussion about numbers of PhDs and research projects, nobody's going to listen to me. But one social media posted joke in pink goes viral, and all of a sudden, hey, you know, people think science matters. And then also when you start thinking about procurement from the standpoint of furniture and things like that, we have to appreciate that economic choices are not always rational choices by people. And so that's when you get into things like people buying up all the toilet paper in the stores and not wearing masks at the same time, right? So I just wanted to bring all of this to your attention because it does really matter in both how you promote the carbon footprint benefits of your products and also how you are interacting with your customers. So we have to appreciate that customers aren't all scientists, and yet this is all really important to communicate. With that, we'll turn you back over to Arnaud.
Thank you, Bill. And it's already time to conclude because, as I said, we want to have 10 minutes with you for the Q&A. So to conclude in a few sentences, climate and health risks are real, and they both must be addressed simultaneously. The furnishing industry can and must play its part in the solution. Innovation will be necessary to shrink our carbon footprint, but innovation is possible. It's what you have been doing in your industry for forever. We keep improving the way we develop furniture and we keep improving our understanding on how important it is to live in a healthy and pleasant environment. So what I hope we can discuss during the Q&A is the role that you see you can take in reducing your carbon footprint, but also simply in engaging both your customers, but also your suppliers. Because when we think about your role as a part of the furnishing supply chain, you might think it's limited, especially if you are, if you are an interior designer, you might think my footprint is very limited. I run a small business with a few persons. I work from home for the moment. I'm mostly working on my computer. What impact do I have? But you have an enormous impact because you are talking with dozens, if not hundreds of clients every year that you can raise their level of awareness. And you are also helping them procure probably for millions of products. And by engaging the suppliers, making sure that themselves they set targets to calculate, reduce the greenhouse gas emission and other negative environmental impacts, your role can be, your influence can be enormous. So that's what I hope we can discuss, all these interconnection between your role as part of the furnishing supply chain and the bigger picture when it comes to human health and climate change.
That's great. Thank you so much, Arnaud and Bill, for this rich information and those important points. And I'm glad we do have some time for questions now. And so if you have not already done so, send in your questions through the chat box. And we've got several questions here. Have you done a greenhouse gas inventory for a furniture retailer? If so, what scope 3 categories did you end up with? Covering what boundaries and what boundaries did you set? So what about for a retailer? You mentioned Steelcase.
Yeah. So Steelcase is a manufacturer, but we work with them on the scope 3 emissions, and they would be similar for a retailer. So to answer the question, no, we haven't worked for a furnishing retailer, but we have worked for another company. No, actually, it's not true. We've done a project for IKEA in Belgium, but in the US we haven't. But we've done a project with IKEA in Belgium, and we've worked also with a company which is very similar to REI, which is also like a retailer of equipment. So it's not furnishing equipment, but and it's called Decathlon. It's a French global company providing sport equipment. And I think the carbon footprint would be very similar when we look at the emission profile with a furnishing retailer. So what we would include in scope 3, it's of course the supply chain. So it's looking at all the products that you offer to your clients. So, and there you can play a very big influence because, for instance, if we take the wood issue, the way we calculate greenhouse gas emission from wood-based products is by looking at the sustainability of the wood that you source. So if you can demonstrate that your wood is coming from a sustainable forest, one which is, for instance, labeled by PEFC or FSC, if you can demonstrate that, it was a growing forest that provided the wood, then wood is going to be considered as a carbon neutral material. So it's not going to impact your scope 3 emissions. If, however, you challenge to demonstrate that, and the wood is coming, let's say, from take in Indonesia, where we know that deforestation happens, then that's going to have a very big impact for your supply chain emissions. This category, so when we look at scope 3 emission, there are 15 different categories. And I'm not going to cover all of them, but so the biggest one would be the sourcing of the products that you sell. But then we can also look at things such as the logistics, all the trucks that came to your warehouse and to your retail store. And if you do online sales, like the type of platform that you use to get the furniture sent to your customers. And there it's very important to start educating the customer that if they want their furniture the next day, that's going to have a worse impact than if they're willing to wait a week or two. Because if they want it the next day, that means that air travel was probably the only solution to bring the furniture to their place. If they're willing to wait 1 week, not only will they save a lot of money, but they're also going to save a lot of carbon emissions. So that's one area where you can play a role. Then we can look at things such as waste, all the waste from packaging, for instance. So there are multiple categories, and you will get our contact details. So I don't want to take like 5 minutes just for that question, but it's a very important one. And do not hesitate to send Bill and myself an email if you want more details.
I know we only have a little time left, but I wanted to add 30 seconds to this comment because the life cycle analysis world that we are currently serving and working within, it interconnects with the scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And the best practices today are actually trying to collect data from the suppliers as opposed to doing what we call spend models of the scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason why that trend is becoming of interest to the the greener suppliers is because they're trying to use their better sustainability practices, like all of you Sustainable Furnishing Council's furniture makers could try to differentiate your practices from any other furniture supplier. And so the idea would be that a building owner or a tenant would actually be able to look at your actual emissions versus just the modeled emissions for their furnishing impacts.
Good. Another question on this subject, are you able to share a greenhouse gas inventory report for a furniture manufacturer, perhaps?
I think,
or a retailer. You mentioned retailers, but I'm wondering whether these reports become available to the public. It often helps people understand to read a report about another company that's similar to theirs in some way.
Yeah, so of course we have confidentiality issues, so we cannot share the files from our clients, but we have many of our clients that do provide public information. So I mentioned Steelcase. There is an organization called CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. If you go to their website, and we can send the link later, but if you go to CDP website, and if you search for Steelcase, you will be able to get access to the CDP climate questionnaire, and there you will find all the detail about the greenhouse gas inventory, how they calculated it, and you will see what scope 3 categories are more important, and you will also see the 15 scope 3 categories that I mentioned. So that's one option. Then some firms such as IKEA, for instance, they have CSR or sustainability reports that are really exhaustive. So I also invite you to go to those big companies such as IKEA and look at their website. They have a sustainability page where you will find lots of information, and also certainly several LCAs that they've done for different products. So LCA, it's a life cycle analysis.
Yeah, good. And on those pages, like at IKEA, you will also find their wood sourcing policy. So you will learn there how that company is making sure that the wood products they source are made with wood that does come from well-managed forests. But the Carbon Disclosure Project that you mentioned is another very good source for understanding what inventories are, as well as for looking at particular companies' inventories. One of our audience is commenting that these examples are really pertinent to them in Dallas. So it is, you showed a picture of New Delhi, but in fact, all of us, no matter what city we're in what country, are having our own experiences of changes in our weather patterns, changes in climate since we were youngsters, for instance, and in what the current shutdown has done in our local environment. So that is interesting to see. Okay, and then we're getting lots of good appreciation comments. One question, and we're at the end of our time, so maybe we'll, one question that comes up though is about the concentration of CO2 emissions in our atmosphere globally. We know that there was a report recently that the carbon is more concentrated in the atmosphere than it ever has been in human history. And here we see our planet warming dramatically, and we know that the planet goes up and down in temperatures anyway. So these concentrations that we are seeing now are impacting life as it has evolved for our race, which is a very serious thing for us to understand. I really appreciate all the information that you have shared and have to share ongoingly as companies choose to work with you about how we relate to this macro situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this opportunity. I'm sorry that we had not more time for the Q&A, but you can always reach out to Bill or myself. You have our contact details, phone number, email addresses. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. You can also find us on LinkedIn.
Sure.
And thank you very much, Suzanne, for this opportunity again. And
yes, thank you all for being. Thank you all for being part of this journey. Yep.
Yeah,
we need you all.
and everybody will stay in touch. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Arnaud. Thank you all who've joined us for this webinar, and we hope you will join us again next month when we will be discussing environmental justice with a panel of our SFC ambassadors. So this is valuable information for us to consider and to make use of in the meantime. Thank you, Bill and Arnaud.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye-bye, Suzanne. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye.